Yeah, but at this point, my head's down and I'm praying. And I'm saying, God, I don't know if you can get me sober. I know that I can't. I know I can't do it. So I don't know if you can, but if there's any hope for me to get sober, you have to do it. I will do whatever you tell me to do. But you have to do it. Do it. Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Recovery Podcast. My name is Matt, and today we'll be doing things a little differently. Specifically, I will be doing things a little differently. I'll be on the opposite end of the conversation as my sponsor and good friend Mitch Spees will interview me as I share my recovery story. I'll share how finally surrendering to my higher power redeemed my lifelong cynicism and isolation and allowed me to have a life built upon faith and relying on others to help me not just stay clean, but experience life in a way I never considered possible.
My name is Mitch Spees, and I am the guest host for this episode of the Recovery Podcast. Today's guest, if you will, and I'm using my air quotes, is the creator of the Recovery Podcast, and that is Matt Marnocha. We're going to talk this evening and get his story into recovery. Before we do so, as has been the regular, we have a quick disclaimer that while we absolutely do encourage our guests to share from their experiences in their recovery programs, there is no one that is a spokesperson or representative of their respective recovery programs that they choose to share their experience from. We want to respect anonymity, and we want to respect the organizations that offer the outreach that many of us have experienced. And we are so grateful for the freedom that we have today through those programs. So we want to honor them.
Absolutely. No, thank you for doing this, by the way. This is weird being on this side of the conversation. I've done, as of the time of us recording this, I've done 6. This will be the 7th one I've done. And so, thankfully, because of stumbling my way through this whole process like a toddler, I have kind of somewhat like, okay, these are the things that work. These are the things that I need to work on. And so I've gotten comfortable being on the other side. And so now we're going to flip that right on its head. And now I get to be the interviewee. And but I'm excited to share my story.
Put the screws to you.
That's right. And for those of you who didn't catch Mitch's episode, which I would highly recommend, Mitch is my sponsor in Celebrate Recovery. And so he's been with me every step of the way in my time being sober. And so it means a lot. It meant a lot not only to interview you, but it also means a lot that you're doing this. So thank you for doing this.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So, quick set of the stage. I think it was just before COVID hit. So that would have been like the fall of 2019 that I think we were introduced. Both you and Kyle had been coming with more regularity to Celebrate Recovery here at the Village, and I was working with Paul Salazar, wrapping up the step study that I did that he was leading with 2 other fellows from RC3. So let's start there. For those who don't know Matt, he's a wall with legs and a mountain of a man in a physical sense.
Recognizable from just about any angle.
Yes. And I honestly, the first impression I had of you was, I want to hear everything this guy has to say because this is going to be fun.
You had no idea.
It's just, so I'm almost 6 foot tall, 300 pound man, and not many people make me look like a runt. And knowing the kind of juggernaut that I was in my active drinking and drugging, I could only imagine the tales. Only imagine the tales. And so let's start there. If you recall the fall of 2019, before the pandemic hit, and proverbially the shit hit the fan, worldwide. As we have discussed and you have disclosed through our step work, you were still active at that time, even though you were coming to recovery meetings.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say I definitely wasn't coming regularly, but I was pretty miserable, and definitely was starting to get the sense at that time that my life was unmanageable, but I wasn't ready to give up yet. And so we did get introduced at that time, and I was coming here and there and to meetings, but definitely wasn't committed. I was just, it was one of those things where Celebrate Recovery, no matter how far out I got, was always in the back of my mind. I always knew I could go back. And so, I mean, I even went through a whole process when I was, really, the pre-rock bottom, if you will, like where I started to flirt with rock bottom. I went through this process where I was like, I need to decide whether or not I can write off like recovery in general, and to do that, I need to see if I can write off God. I couldn't write off God. I went through this process that I'll talk more in depth later about probably, and because I couldn't write off God, I couldn't write off recovery, because I had no other way to explain what had happened, and the guys or the people in CR that I had seen, like Randy and Carol Holly, who are both going to be on the podcast at some point. Daryl, which was already on. Bob. I mean, these guys that were kind of like they were just like these examples of guys that had struggled and had some pretty wild stories. And I'm like, there's no way that they got sober without supernatural help. I just as cynical as I was, I couldn't write it off. And so I had this in the back of my mind as I use. So the pandemic hits and I get laid off for the time being. And so I decided, you know what, like if there's any time to just go for broke with my using, it's now. I'm off work. Like I don't have, other than, like, and really even with the kids, like the responsibilities were just with the kids at home. It wasn't like I had to take them anywhere. I was like, and I went for it, man. And I wound up miserable. I realized real quick that it wasn't anything I could sustain. I was either going to die or lose my marriage or both. And that's what led me into joining a step study I think we started in the summer of 2020.
Into the summer.
Yeah, I think it was
my recollection.
I think it was like August or something like that of 2020. That's when, and I was still using as fervently as I was, and leading up to that.
Yeah, because your sobriety date is in October, right before mine, correct? Or September? Kyle's is October?
No, I think mine is October like 30th or something like that. I have it on my phone somewhere, but it's something like that. And I think Kyle is like 5 weeks after me or something like that, or something along that effect. Yeah. So we start in August. It takes me till the end of October. That's how long it took me. I'm a slow learner, and all of that, keep in mind that I've been in CR for 10 or 11 years at this point. So I'm I'm like short of a helmet, slower learner. That's probably mean to say, I shouldn't say that. But listen, man, I don't have to take responsibility for this episode.
So I don't want to lose some of the history of your youth and young adult years. So, but at the same time, I don't want to lose the momentum here of what you're talking about. That August, September, October of 2020. I mean, that's the groundwork of your life turning around.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And one of the favorite stories I hear you tell is you sitting in step study and having that conversation with Randy about faith.
We talked about that story in Daniel's podcast where he had a similar moment, and we can go back and get the history later, but I agree. this is the part I like to tell, so why not start the podcast with it? But, at this point, I'm coming in, and I very begrudgingly started the step study. I had, I was not looking forward to it. It was one of those things where I can only attribute it to God, because I don't know what, I think I was just like, I don't think this is going to work, but I'm going to do something else.
Well, there's the company line, right? That nobody comes in on a winning streak.
That's right.
So we are well versed.
Of
the foot dragging, grumpy, grouchy, person struggling with just any kind of willingness, right?
Right. And so this is the point where I make a Bengals reference, being a Bengals fan. I was on like a Bengals franchise level of losing streak, but now the Bengals have turned that around. So I'm going to go with the Lions, the Detroit Lions, knowing where you hail from, your fandom hails from.
And that's fair.
And you're a Pats fan, but right?
Only because I used to be a Lions fan.
I was a Packers fan, same reason, for a long time. But yeah, I was on a Detroit Lions level of losing streak coming into this step study. And, man, I came in and I was like, I'm like, if I'm going to do this, then I'm going to be honest. I'm going to be honest about my using. I'm going to be honest about my doubts. I'm going to be honest about everything that I think is quite frankly horseshit that I can't buy into. And so poor guys in my step study every week had to listen to me bitch about the same things. And that was what it boiled down to, was me constantly going, I don't understand why I have to have this faith component to my recovery. Like faith, not in the sense of religion, but in the sense of like me putting faith in a higher power. I just could not come to grips with it, because I'm like, why would I do that? Like,
so if I may interject, the flip side of that is, why can't I fix myself?
Right.
Why can't I? Why do I have to step out of myself and find something outside of me?
Mm-hmm.
That's how this works.
Yeah, and Daniel in his interview, which I think will be released after this, but more than anybody that I've interviewed so far, Daniel and I have had. I found myself at complete parallel with him almost. And I remember him being I remember when he started at Celebrate Recovery. And at the time, I was somewhat sober when he started. It was like my first kind of taste of sobriety, even though it was a lot of white knuckling and not a lot of faith. But I remember him just being pissed to be there. And I remember at one point during the step study that I was also a part of, that I eventually quit, that he was just like, I'm just pissed that I'm an addict. Like, I'm pissed that I'm a junkie. And that's where I was. I just didn't say it so eloquently. I kind of like sidestepped it and made it about God. And I'm just like, and after weeks, months of me complaining about the same thing, of like, why do I have to go outside of myself and take this step of faith to get sober? I'm sitting in the room, in the meeting room, and sitting at one of the tables, and I'm by myself at this table, but this is COVID, everybody's spread out. And I'm pointing to the other side of the table, and I'm like, I don't understand. Why can't God just show up on the other side of that table, sit down across from me, and tell me I can get you sober? I wouldn't. Then I would believe him. If he did that for me, I would buy into this. I would believe that he could do it if he sat across this table and I could see him and he told me. Like, I don't understand why I have to have faith. And Randy looks at me in a way that only Randy Holly can, and he says,
kind of like the Cocker Spaniel cocked head, kind of.
Totally. Cocked head and kind of like this shrug, shoulder shrug. And he goes, why don't you try faith? And so literally in any other circumstance, if somebody would have said something like that to me, I would have taken it in the same way as if, like, imagine a lifeguard is looking at somebody drowning in front of them and they're like, hey man, why don't you try to swim? Like, any other time I'd be like, screw you, dude.
Right.
Like,
Flip table.
Right. I would have survived out of spite. Like, but he said it and it clicked. Like, all of a sudden it clicked in my head. I'm like, I've tried everything else. I've tried and I realized that it didn't have to actually, and this is going to sound maybe for those who haven't experienced this. It was like, I understood that I didn't have to believe it.
Right.
I just had to believe that it could.
Right.
Like I had to have like I mean, when they talk in scripture where they talk about the faith the size of a mustard seed, I was smaller. I mean, it was microscopic. I was at the atomic level.
And we've heard, many, many times in meetings, sometimes even having willingness to have willingness.
Right. And that's where I was. Like, I was willing to try something else. Is basically what it boiled down to. In my prayer, we moved on. Somebody else finally got to share, but at this point, my head's down and I'm praying and I'm saying, God, I don't know if you can get me sober. I know that I can't. I know I can't do it. So I don't know if you can. But if there's any hope for me to get sober, you have to do it. I will do whatever you tell me to do, but you have to do it. And that was my prayer. That's how small my prayer was. That's how small the scope was. But it set off a chain of events in my life that changed me forever.
And so let's pause there for a second, because I think this is a monumental moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a very similar experience early in my recovery as well, that I regularly and bristle is a term that is mentioned specifically in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Is that so many of us bristle at the notion of God. I bristled in addition to the notion of God, coming from a very agnostic existence prior to recovery, but I also had the same reaction to the idea of surrender. And that moment for you, as I have learned about you and I have gotten to know you over the few years that we've been connected and now friends, you gave up the fight.
Yeah.
You quit the debating society, right? And I did the exact same thing in a moment where I had a choice, where I could continue to smash my face into the wall, changing nothing. The exercise of insanity, expecting different results. Or I could, for once, take the suggestion of giving up.
It's exactly what it was. I mean, for those who have known me growing up, a lack of fight is not something that I have. And a lot of it's out of spite, and it's driven out of my disdain for authority or whatever, or somebody making it, especially if somebody's treating me better as if they're better than me, which is probably part of the reason why I bristled, right? This misguided
imbecilic arrogance.
Exactly. Couldn't have said it better. And so, like, the thought of giving up, surrendering my life to a higher power, I exactly bristled. I was like, I don't want to hear that crap. Like, I don't want to hear about it. It's not for me. If I can't fix me, I don't know if anybody can fix me.
I don't want that brand to help.
Right. Yeah. And it's exactly what I gave up the fight. For the first time in my life, I gave up the fight. And other than up to that point, the sad reality is the only thing I had ever surrendered to is my using. It's the only thing I ever surrendered to, and it didn't get me anywhere. It made things worse. In a weird way, twisted way, my drug of choice was my higher power. Everything, my entire life revolved around it. And I know that's something that everybody who's ever struggled with a substance addiction can relate to, that my entire day revolved around using. And in the same way, my entire day now revolves around recovery of some manner, whether it's intentional by me or not. Like the one intentional thing I do every day is I'm going to surrender today to you. And so from there, God provides typically for me what I can't provide for myself.
Right.
But yeah, that was a good way to put it. I never thought about that way. Yeah. I gave up the fight for the first time.
Yeah, because we are control freaks, with no doubt about it. And I had an epiphany that was sparked by a conversation with a couple of guys, casually, but a couple of guys that were also in recovery. This was years ago, in Michigan, in Detroit, before I moved down here. where we kind of framed up that at any point we feel like we are in control. And with the arrogance, the imbecilic arrogance that we're going to manipulate anything in reality, we have summarily declared that we at that moment are the most powerful force in the universe, because it takes everything in the universe that God puts in motion to create the here and the now. This moment takes an infinite number of variables. And when we foolishly convince ourselves that I got this. I got this. And then how many times we are absolutely stupefied by the 2x4 to the head with like, I don't got this.
I don't have this. Like, it's to the point now with being on the flip side and having 2.5 years, which is I'm still a baby in recovery, but I do know this, that like there's still part of me, there's still that broken part of me, that character defect inside of me that still wants to take control all the time, to the point that it being in recovery, one of the things I had to wrestle with was this paralyzing fear that if I can't engage with anything because I'm scared at some point I'm going to make it about me. I'm going to try to take control and I'm going to ruin it. I'm going to burn it to the ground. I had that fear when I started this podcast, that if I do this, I'm going to make this about me and I'm going to ruin it.
And see, one of the things that I have learned, and some of them are specifically taught, in recovery, that there are some paradoxes that have to exist. The first one that we've already talked about is surrender, right? To win, we have to surrender. And in faith, you and I have had the very specific conversation that doubt and uncertainty has to exist for faith to be present, because if we had surety, we wouldn't need faith.
Right.
And I think there's always going to be that element within us, that brokenness, that's evidenced by our struggle for the desire of control. Because without it, we would never have the inkling to invite God into our lives and take control. So it's these very counterintuitive things about us and our spirit and our mind that makes all this possible.
Right.
And that's it's so simple when you recognize what some of those things are and how they dovetail together. But it's the difficulty is one, the commitment. This is a daily decision at minimum, sometimes hour to hour, right?
Phone call to phone call.
Right. And I when I have those, those things unveiled to me, it's like, wow, I don't need drugs to be mystified.
Right. And so it kind of goes along the line, something that Daryl and I talked about on his episode, where I'm like, it goes kind of in line with that a little bit. And that is, I wouldn't wish addiction on anybody. Recovery is the hardest thing I've ever done. Recovery was harder than has been parenting for me so far, because out of
you have two girls that are still pubescent.
Right. So
hold your horses.
So I'm going to take that with a grain of salt. That may change later. I will update as necessary. But the reason why I say that is that out of my recovery and out of me working on me flows my ability to be a parent, to be a husband, to be a friend, to be a coworker, to be
absolutely
whatever. And so I find that out of me focusing on me and cleaning up my side of the street, things tend to fall in line. And so, but I say, like, I would never wish addiction on anybody, but there is a certain, I want to be careful how I say this, there's a certain privilege that we experience as addicts, because we get to see in the same way that we live in that tension of contrasting things that are opposite but always tied together. Because I hit rock bottom, I got to surrender.
Right.
It was the opportunity for me to finally give up the fight to a higher power, and out of that came every blessing that I've experienced from there on out, and honestly before, but things I couldn't appreciate before I was sober, now I get to appreciate. The new things in my life that I appreciate are come out of that surrender to that higher power, and so I'm thankful. I'm thankful for the things that I've gone through.
Yeah, that's such a critical piece, that attitude of gratitude.
Mm-hmm.
You know, early in my recovery, going to AA meetings and hearing people introduce themselves as a grateful alcoholic. It's like, what do you got to be grateful about being an alcoholic?
Right.
Well, because, and this is what I, you know, it's a process, right? But as I learned for myself, to know what my issue is a huge, huge leg up in the game of life. Because there are lots of people who have the same underlying hurts, hangups, and habits that don't necessarily manifest into chemical dependency or overeating or pornography or any of the tangible sins, right? They have no idea what's wrong with them. They just know that they're not right.
Right.
That they're broken, they're jacked up, they're screwed up, and for whatever reason, they are constantly fighting against the flow of the universe on a regular basis and have no idea. And my heart breaks for people who are trying to live life with no idea of what really is at the heart of the matter. You know, the flawed human condition.
Yeah. I mean, really, like what makes what, and again, knowing between the two people sitting across from each other right now, our higher power is Jesus Christ. Really, the Christian faith is not that different than a recovery program. It's not different. I don't see a lot of, in fact, pretty much everything runs in parallel between Celebrate Recovery specifically, because that's a Christ-centered program. But even in AA and NA, there's a parallel there between what the discipleship process looks like and what recovery is.
Yep.
What happens during the discipleship process? What happens during that sanctification process that we go through? That tends to be cyclical in the sense that there's constantly this something new to work on. In our faith, that looks an awful lot like doing inventory, doing amends, sharing the 12th step.
The peeling of the onion.
That's right, and so it's no coincidence to me. You know, I mean, it's a coincidence in the sense that I didn't. It's not readily apparent sometimes, but if you look at it, you could tell that, especially with Celebrate Recovery, it's very much modeled after that, and it's also no coincidence that as my recovery, because I'd at least written off church when I got sober, and that was something that another fight I surrendered. At the end of that step study that I got sober was somebody saying, hey man, like, you surrender to this higher power. Don't you think it's important to be a part of the body of Christ? If you're going to surrender to Christ as your higher power, like, is it important that you be a part of the church? You know, even if it's the benefit of your kids or your wife or whatever. And I was like, I guess, you know.
Well, as you are well aware of now, it's the fellowship. You know, in AA, there was many times the debate of, you know, the AA, what came first, chicken or the egg version was what came first, the program or the fellowship, you know, or which is more powerful. And it's like they one doesn't exist without the other.
That's right.
You know, because it's the we, right? And the church is the same thing. The church is exactly the same thing. I can't really truly experience God the way he intended me to experience God without other people.
Yeah, I mean, that's literally the again, going back to this contrast thing, I was a isolated, cynical person before I got sober. And now, what are the things that I rely on? I rely on other people, and I rely on faith. which are if you would have told me before a couple, 2.5 years ago, hey man, the two kind of pillars of your life in a sense, or two of the main pillars of your life are going to be your faith in Jesus Christ being your higher power, your dependence on him in your faith, and then other people, relying on other people to keep you upright. And that's exactly what happened. And it's, I don't call it divine irony, call it God's plan, whatever you want to call it. God knew what he was doing. He knew that what I was leaning into in my character defects, the thing that I felt safe in kind of this self-made, isolated prison of cynicism and overall just kind of being a dick, I needed to be pulled out of that. And the thing that was going to keep me out of that prison was other people and a dependence on a higher power.
Mm-hmm.
So, man, this has been good stuff. Do you think we should jump to should we take it a step back? And
well, so yeah, I want to kind of rein us back in to some degree and bring us back to at least the timeline. So you have this conversation with Randy in step study. You have this surrender through prayer of finally, in a genuine, sincere fashion, inviting God in.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that we both know now is that making a decision is one thing, but taking action is another. So my second favorite story of your early recovery was you throwing out all your stuff.
Oh yeah.
So what I'm not certain of, and I'm going to ask you for the sake of the podcast and the episode, is that do I have the time? Do I have the chronological correct in that the conversation with Randy and the prayer happened first, and then it was that night you went home?
It was that night, yeah. And like for me, my drug of choice at the time was kratom, and especially during the pandemic, it got expensive, and especially at the quantity that I was having to use to sustain myself. It was, it's to the point that like I don't cringe at a lot of things in my past anymore. I've kind of dealt through, but there are times where I'm like, dude, what an idiot. You were spending so much money on that crap. but the reason why I bring that up is that I go home and my mind's racing the entire way home, and I know what I need to do. I know that I need to go home and I need to dump my stash. If I'm going to do this, I need to commit and
get some skin in the game.
I know that it's different this time. I know that it's different. But that doesn't make the other voice any quieter.
Oh no,
telling me how crazy I am. And so I walk in the door, and when at my house, you walk in the door and you can hit where I kept my stash in the bathroom was like right there. Before you walked into the living room, the living room's kind of in the back of our house. That's where my wife and kids are. So I gather my stuff, and I've got this armful of stuff, and I know that I've got one trash can that's open, and it had rained the night before, and I had at least had one kid in diapers, and I was like, I know that thing's going to be nasty. That's where it's going. I got to dump it. Like, I can't just throw the bottles in there because I'll go in there and fish them out. But even I won't dig out some diaper water, kratom. Even I have more self-respect. I didn't.
Have your standards.
But so I walk past, and I come kind of barreling through the kitchen past the living room, and my wife and my kids are sitting there. My wife looks at me, and I see her eyes get wide, and I'm like, she's like, I hear her get the word "what," and I know what she's about to say is, "What are you doing?" And at this point, I'm full blown, like the whole like angel on one shoulder, demon on the other,
and we're a diesel locomotive headed down the track.
Yeah, dude, and dude, like the demon side is absolutely screaming at me. Absolutely. Just throwing a fit. I can hear this. It's legitimate war going on in my head. But the thing that I remember, one, is the other voice was this. We hear this kind of phrase thrown around in Christianese called still small voice of God. But that's exactly what it was. It was this calm. It was this even, you're doing the right thing. This is different, and this is different. I remember that this is different. This time is different. And it was not me because I'm cynical. And so I don't believe anything's going to be different. And even then, there was a faith growing inside of me that was not of my own making.
Hours old.
But it was enough for me to walk out that door. Well, it was enough, one, for my wife said what I said. And I'm sorry, Natalie. I was like, shut up before I change my mind. That's what I said to her. I said, shut up before I change my mind. And I opened the door and I open each bottle and I pour them out, pour the contents into that dirty diaper water. And I do it. And it was like, woof, the voice stopped. And I was left and I'm standing there and there's part of me in disbelief. Like, I can't believe I just did that. Like, I can't afford to replace this. If like, there's that part of my brain going like, if this doesn't work out, I'm kind of screwed. Like, what am I going to do? And I'm like, doesn't matter. Like, this time is going to be different. And I've never told myself that ever. That's how I knew it wasn't for me. And those of you who know me personally know that I'm not like I don't tend to be kind of a hyper spiritual sensationalist kind of person in my faith, even though like kind of going back to growing up or going to, thinking back, like I grew up in a lot of Southern Baptist, Pentecostal, which has a lot of
charismatic.
Yes. But because of that baggage, I tend to downplay things a lot. But I knew that it was the Holy Spirit. I just knew. Mm-hmm. And I walk back in and my wife's almost in tears. And I'm just like, I walk back in just stunned. Like I remember walking back in the house and I'm just like, what did I just do? And I'm like, well, I guess I'm doing this. And so, from there started the process of, I need a sponsor. Like, it was that night that I was like, I need to find somebody. And I don't think it was many days after I reached out to you and said, hey man, would you consider being my sponsor? And you're like, yeah, let me pray about it. And then from then on, it was you and Kyle and a couple other guys. I mean, I lived phone call to phone call. I got over my fear of talking about what I was struggling with real quick because I'm like, I'm on this train, like, and it's going to hurt if I fall off. Mm-hmm. Like I want to, like the fear and the pain was enough to make me pick up that phone for the first time in my life. Cause I never would reach out.
And that's another thing that we've talked about at length over the years is that a lot of times, a lot of people only have fear and pain mm-hmm. as the initial motivators, to get into recovery. I had a friend of mine, that phrased it so well that I've stolen it.
We do that all the time.
Yeah, we do.
There's no intellectual property.
We plagiarize recovery like
right.
There's no. I don't know anybody has an original thought in recovery anymore. But he said that it is only when we are properly and adequately horrified with our circumstances and our situation that the pain of staying the same finally surpasses the pain and fear of change. That we need relief.
Yeah.
And what we had used for however long we had used was not working anymore. Mm-hmm. And so that fear and that pain is oftentimes the initial motivators to start that change. But the thing is that change can't be sustained by fear and pain because unfortunately, one of our greatest attributes being human beings is also one of our greatest liabilities in the fact that we endure and we acclimate and we adjust and we persevere. And over a long enough span of time, pain and fear and that uncomfortability becomes our new norm. Mm-hmm. And whether it's good for us or not, it becomes comfortable, mm-hmm. which is why we get to the ends of ourselves the way we do in active addiction and the kind of compulsive behaviors we exhibit. So what has to happen is hope mm-hmm. has to enter the equation and replace fear and pain. Yeah, and again, that goes back to us having to be in fellowship because Absolutely. We need to see that evidence that The program's working. Recovery is working. Maybe not for us initially. We don't see it ourselves. A lot of times, change within oneself, we're the last ones to see it. But when we're working shoulder to shoulder and stride with other people, kind of heading in the same direction, we see the strides and the progress that they're making, and we're like, I can hitch my wagon onto that.
Absolutely.
So in your step study, you're witnessing that, right?
Yeah. Well, I remember, and I think the way you phrased what you just said was that pain and fear are good initial motivators, but they can't sustain you.
Right.
Only hope can sustain you. And that's something that I've shared with guys that are getting started in the recovery, that, I mean, the pain of what you've done and going, the fear of going back to it only work for so long. Like there's got to be hope that God can give you. I mean, another thing that was in my prayer was, God, if I'm going to give this up, being my using, you got to give me something better. That was another part of that I failed to mention, but it was an important piece of it. And we'll share what hope looked like for me later. But
spoiler alert, though, God's batting average of bringing something better,
yeah,
pretty dang good.
If there's something above 1,000, he's there. But yeah, I mean, that was the next challenge of so the initial, let's say 90 days, where, and generally speaking, when you start recovery, there's kind of two components, especially substance addiction. One, there's the behavioral and experiential side of it that's rough, right? Because you're going against the grain of what you've gotten comfortable with. There's also the kind of physiological side of it that Dr. Brett Dowdy mentioned again, sorry to keep hearkening back to other episodes, but there's so much good stuff to pull from it. It's part of that fellowship component, right?
Interconnectedness.
Where he kind of talks about, like, it takes about 90 days for your brain to reset from, if you've been kind of what he referred to it as, standing on your dopamine receptors by use of substance or whatever it is that your vice is. It doesn't have to be a substance, but for me it was. It takes a while for your brain to reset.
Right, because there's a toxicity to whatever the levels are, plus the substances we're ingesting. So, we go through withdrawals. We go through a whole spectrum of that physiological,
right,
episodes. And
you've trained your brain that this is what brings me relief.
Right.
And so what happens when we all use, right, is that the other things in our life stop having meaning, and we stop, drawing any kind of enjoyment from it. So those first 90 days are brutal. And if you're listening and you haven't started recovery yet and you're thinking about it, I have to be honest with you. It is brutal. You're going to, especially if you have a substance addiction, like it's going to be rough. But that's where I mention it just about every episode. Living phone call to phone call was so key for me, because I needed reminders that, like, there was going to be, I didn't see a light at the end of the tunnel for those first 90 days, but you did, as my sponsor and as somebody who's worked recovery, and Randy and everybody, the other guys in Step Study. Those were the guys that I leaned on, because I was like, I know that they've found the light at the end of that tunnel. I don't see it yet, but if there's one there, they probably know where it's at. And so it kept the perspective that just because I feel like there's no end to this, that there's probably an end to this. And again, I don't know if I actually believed it. I just knew that the alternative was, I mean, what is the saying? Like, try it for X amount of weeks or 6 weeks, and your misery is...
Try it for 90 days. The AA makes the very, very bold proposition of do 90 meetings in 90 days. And a lot of that has to do with specific clinical psychological studies that recognize that 90 days is about 12 weeks. That's usually what it takes to establish new habits and break old habits. And also within that is that, the frequency of being in the meetings, it's full immersion, right? It's full immersion. It's also a chance to create new network and social structures,
right?
Because a lot of times we have to abandon, the faces and places we used to haunt,
right?
And especially for somebody who's brand new into recovery, there's language and culture that needs to be gotten used to and experience.
Mhm.
And then lastly, with hopefully enough regularity at the same meetings, you have a chance to meet some people that you can connect with that becomes accountability partners,
Mhm.
and maybe 1, 2, 3, a small handful of possible candidates for sponsor,
Mhm.
right? But the crux of what you're saying though is trust the process.
Yeah, your misery's, what is it? Misery back guarantee or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
butchering
We'll
it,
give
but
you. Yeah. We'll give it 90 days. We'll guarantee your misery.
right.
And one other thing I want to add is, as you said, especially with substance abuse, with again a spectrum of experiences of what quitting and withdrawals and all those things may be. Here's an opportunity to plug that. There are wonderful clinical
Mhm. Absolutely.
facilities and programs to assist in that.
Right.
That I personally subscribe to the idea that therapists and counselors work
Mhm.
and can help
Absolutely.
a great deal, because what most people in recovery, regardless of how much time they've had, how much experience they've got, what kind of wisdom they have, many of us are not licensed therapists or counselors. And there is definitely, I'm convinced of this 1,000%. There is a clinical side of the physical body
Mhm.
and the human experience that sometimes needs to be bolstered
Mhm.
along with the spiritual experience that we're doing a great deal talking about. So I want to offer that
For sure. Yeah.
in a plug.
Yeah. I mean, to kind of piggyback off of that, one of the things that I started to realize in my recovery journey was that I had depression. And I've always had depression. Like, going back to my early childhood, the earliest childhood memory that I can recall, I remember feeling depressed. I remember it. I mean, it was a constant companion. And so I got tired of my brain fighting me all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so out of my recovery, it was a key part of it was finally going to see a doctor and trying a medication. And I had to try a couple to find the one that worked. And then now it's not that, it's, for me, it's not like the medication wipes it out, but what it does is it quiets the hum
Mm-hmm.
to the point that when I have, I kind of have like a baseline depression, and then every once in a while it spikes. I have specific times of the year that it tends to spike. In the middle of the summer, it kind of hits me. After, right before the holidays, it tends to hit me. But because I've sought clinical help, and I do have that medical part of it working in my favor, it's to the point now that I can at least, when I feel it picking up, I know that it's like, I'll take stock. I'll reach out and say, hey, I'm struggling today. My depression's really bad. And, I'll kind of look and I'm like, is there anything in my life that would warrant this depression? And if there's something I need to fix, then fine, I'll fix it. If it still persists, I know that it's just, I got some funky brain stuff going on. And there's a certain amount of freedom that comes with, even though it's still there, of understanding that there's nothing wrong right now. It's just, I've got that physiological component fighting against me, and that's fine. I can deal with it. I'll deal with that. As opposed to it, the way that it used to make me feel was the sky is falling. It was kind of like, it would start with this deep depression that would pull me away from everybody, and I would sense myself kind of pulling away from everybody and start to isolate. And thankfully with recovery, people would be like, hey man, you all right?
Mm-hmm.
You just haven't seemed like you're all there. You seem like you're distant, you haven't been picking up the phone.
Or you're missing meetings.
Yeah, whatever the case may be, people kind of and then it's like, oh yeah, okay. Now it's like, I recognize it, and that's usually kind of one of my red flags. And I'm like, okay, I got something going on. Time to take a look under the hood, so to speak. And, from there, once I kind of take stock and do a little inventory and figure out where I'm at, then it's like, I just got to weather this. It's going to be okay. The sky isn't falling. Because what would happen is I would isolate, get deep and down, and then the anxiety would hit after that. Oh crap, something's really wrong. Because out of my isolation, my circumstances would get worse, right? Like my life would suffer.
Oh yeah.
And then out of that comes the anxiety that the sky is falling.
Yeah,
like
because when you're in the echo chamber of yourself,
right.
you become very convincing that even the most absurd worst case scenario is like, oh yeah, that's definitely happening.
Yeah. So for sure, if especially if you're starting out, like I forget what the statistic was that Brett shared, but I felt like it was low. But there's a good possibility that if you're coming into recovery and you're struggling, I'm not saying you have some kind of mental health issue that you should address, but it should be something you should at least be open to keeping an eye out for.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do find yourself thinking, I think anxiety is something I'm struggling with, or depression is something I'm really struggling with, go seek help. There's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong with that.
Well, in my practical experience, that I think supports exactly what you're saying. Early recovery, I heard some old timers, say in a very casual fashion, for a lot of us, when we go into that professional grade of alcoholism, and drug abuse, because
pro, that's a good way to put it.
Well, so it's no longer recreational. It's
right.
regular use for regular escape. This
Mm-hmm.
is my now preferred coping mechanism. That we typically quit growing emotionally, spiritually, maybe even mentally, depending on some of the side effects of what our substance abuse causes, and that changes the scope for us of how to deal with life on life's terms.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So I'm not at all surprised that there is a rampant tendency of both anxiety and depression in people in recovery, especially substance abusers,
mm-hmm.
because we changed the playing field on ourselves by not having the chance to regularly address circumstances in our life where that's typically where we would have, the training of life.
Mm-hmm.
To say, okay, this isn't that bad. I've lived through some things, right? This is how you manage some things. All we did was turn and run, and all that stuff, And now, in my case, yours is very similar. When you get sober in almost 30 years old, and in a lot of ways you're still a 15 or 17-year-old boy trying to figure out, I've got all these responsibilities of life.
Mm-hmm.
I was lucky. When I got sober, I didn't have a wife and a kid yet. All I had was just, a beat up car and a crappy job, and a place I rented, thinking that those were enough for me to convince anybody I didn't have a problem.
Right.
Because I had stuff.
Right.
Stuff nobody wanted, but it was mine nonetheless. So, that's where I want to go next with this is, so abstinence, is not the end game. It's the leaping off point.
Exactly.
In recovery. It's not so much that I'm no longer drinking anymore, or I'm no longer drugging anymore, because if that was the case, it'd be a 1-step program, not a 12-step program. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that. And as we mentioned the phrase already, the peeling the onion. We go through step study. We go through step work. One of those main components is we've already crossed the dependence. Self-reliance is inadequate. Mm-hmm. So we need a dependence on a higher power. Next is we got to take a real good look at ourselves.
Yeah. Okay. So the hardest part about recovery for me has not been getting sober. Like you said, it was a launching point. That was the thing that so especially as you go through your 90 days, right? And you start to feel like, for lack of it, like you start to feel like a normal person, to an extent. maybe depending on who you are, for me, like that's when, you know, maybe some circumstances started kind of working out, you know, like some of the crap going on in my life as a result of my using starts to go because I'm not using anymore.
Surprise, surprise.
Right. Funny how that works out. And so this changes. And like, you know, like I remember, you know, at about that 90-day point was the first time that I ever had a moment of happiness in a vacuum. And in the sense that like I can enjoy a moment for what it was. And I've told the story, and people are probably getting sick of it at this point. I think I've told it in just about every episode I've done of my moment of my first moment of happiness being sober. And that was driving down. I remember where I was. I was on, I think that's Landon Drive right there by the Kroger in Landon. Driving down there, and my kids are in the car with me. I got the windows down. It's like one of those rare summer days where it's like 75 with no humidity, which is almost never in Ohio.
You can count how many times in the last 10 years on one hand.
And it's just a gorgeous day, and the girls are in the back, and we're just jamming. Like we're listening. I'll never forget the song we were listening to. And we're
do tell. What song was it?
Ah, man, I know the song, but I can't remember the name of it because it's like it's by a dude. It's by a dude from Canada, and it's like it's like one of those songs that like became popular and like through memes basically.
Okay.
And I can't remember the name of it, but like it's playing in my head right now, and it's like I think it's just called like Dance or something like that, and it's really catchy. I still love the song. My kids still love it, and we're jamming, dude. We're just jamming, and I'm just being a goofball, and like I don't care who sees me. Like I'm having the time of my life with just this fat dude in the front seat of a Kia Soul, which is if you ever saw me in person, you would understand how humorous that is to begin with.
It is the epitome of the clown car.
Hey man, you can't hate on the Kia Soul. Shout out to the Kia Soul because that is the roomiest car that you can get.
Well, now I understand why they used hamsters in the advertisements, because that's what Matt is shaped like, a ginormous hamster.
Little less now, but yeah, for sure. And they were just jamming, and it was like time slowed down.
Right.
And like I'm looking, and like I mean the sun's coming down. It's like this beautiful sunset kind of, and like I look in the rearview mirror and I see my kids, and they're just happy, and they're just, and I remember looking at them, and I'm like, they're having that good of a time with me, and I had this thought that like, there's nothing wrong with my life right now. There's no other shoe that's going to drop. There's nobody waiting around a corner to bust me upside the head. There's no repercussion that I'm waiting for. There's no sense of I'm a fraud right now because my kids don't know what I'm doing. None of that. I'm like, I'm happy right now. It was the first time I had felt happy in years, probably ever, maybe. Right. And outside of maybe like the birth of my kids. And that's when I knew that was the point. That's the point for me that the motivation for my recovery switched from that fear and that pain that we talked about to hope.
Because the fruits of your labor now is visceral.
Yes. And I realized that, and it was in that moment that I also realized that the prayer that I had where I'm like, God, if I give this up, you have to give me something better.
Boom.
And he was like, and I realized it was my life, which had my marriage and my family had survived in spite of me. And that was the blessing that I did not deserve. That was from the hand of God through Natalie working her own program. That's the only reason our marriage survived. I'm convinced of it. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, this is the better thing. And this is so much better.
So let me ask this. What you just described was a moment.
Mm-hmm.
In all honesty, prior to that, how many moments did you truly live in?
I can't think of a single one.
And I think that's another thing that we never bargained for, and it's hard to really explain, especially to the newcomer. You go right over their head, right? But because of that depression and because of that anxiety that we've already talked about, we are masterful at living in other places than the here and the now. We live in tomorrow. We live in yesterday all the time. And we never appreciate the sereneness, right, of now. And that's where happiness exists.
Because there was always this fear of, one, when I was using, it was either me feeling like crap or me regretting my decisions or me regretting my behavior or looking at the life that I was ardently trying to destroy and regretting yesterday. Or I was thinking about the next time I was going to use.
Right.
And a lot of this, I think, goes back to my childhood, but there's also that part of me that was always fearful of the that shoe that I keep talking about to drop. I was always waiting for the rug.
Up.
I was always waiting for the rug to get pulled out from under me. And it's not now. It's not that now. It's not that bad things don't happen or things happen that suck to me. It's not that. It's that through recovery, I've learned to when the blessings come, enjoy them. Take the time to like smell the roses.
Don't sabotage them.
Yeah, like you don't have to like shit all over a good moment. And that's something that I was super guilty of. There was not a good moment in my life that I wouldn't just take a dump on. Sorry for the visual, but it's really what I was doing. And I don't, and yeah, like the reason why the fear and the pain switched to hope at that moment, because I realized that like there's actual happiness that I can experience. There's actual peace that I can experience. And it's not, the thing that gave me hope is that I knew it wasn't for me. That's the part that gave me hope.
Right.
Because I knew that if it was for me, I would ruin it. But because it's not, because it's from my higher power and it's because of the fellowship that I experience at CR, and it's from the ability I have that no matter what comes my way, there's somebody I can lean on. I don't have to do this by myself. All of those things in my corner, working for my benefit, I know that the blessings I have can't be taken from me. There might be a darker day in the future that I'm going to have to experience, I'm going to have to deal with, but nothing can take this moment from me right now.
Right.
And nothing will ever take that moment that I just described. That is something that I will hold on to for the rest of my life. And I think that's what's important. That's the reason why if you're listening to this and you're new in sobriety or you're struggling and you haven't found the light at the end of that tunnel, there's nobody in this, I'm convinced there's nobody in this world that believed more than I did that I was special. I genuinely thought that, like, yeah, it worked for Randy, it worked for Bob, it worked for Daryl, it worked for Carol, but they're not me. Well, here I am. So I don't know how many people have to go through recovery who shared that exact same sentiment that I've had, who it's been turned on their head.
Countless.
And there's some part of us that's going to ignore it. It doesn't matter how much evidence is stacked. And
the irony is that that's the evidence,
right?
That we're convinced we're terminally unique,
right? That's right. I knew there was a phrase that you used that was terminally unique. That's pretty good. Yeah, and I mean,
and beyond saving,
right?
That God can't touch us. We're out of His reach.
And it's almost like, man, if only there was scripture to speak against that, right? But that just speaks to just how irrational and quite frankly insane a lot of us end up in our using, just devoid of any logic.
So now we have hope. Now we have your why. You're doing this, right? So we start the inventory process, and what was one of the things that you were kind of surprised to find out? And when I say we do our inventory process, this is us trying to get to root cause, right? Why not? Because again, now we're not using anymore, but there's got to be a reason why we used the way we used.
Right.
Because that was one of the things that I was taught in recovery is that it didn't matter what I drank. It didn't matter how much I drank. Didn't matter when I drank, because those could all be different and those could all be the same to somebody else. But it came to why. Right. Why was the oblivion so appealing?
Well, it goes, so I forget who coined it, but I've stolen it a few times when I introduce myself in meetings, is that I'm a drug addict with a problem named Matt. And whoever said it was, I'm an alcoholic with a problem named.
And they're brilliant for it.
Yeah, right. and I realized that. I was like, there's a reason why I've wanted to use. There's a reason, and I think not to get too off the rails, but part of to actually stay on track, part of my inventory process was me kind of addressing my depression. Mm-hmm. And I think a big part of that, and it was kind of affirmed it when I went to see my doctor, because he's like, I've been seeing you for 5 or 6 years now. Like, you've known this whole time you have depression. I've told you, I've prescribed you medication. You haven't taken it. Like, it's not so. And I had shared with him my recovery and all of that. And he's like, like in my experience, like a lot of people who don't, like, you're going to find a way to medicate one just because you weren't taking the prescription I gave you. You're going to self-medicate most likely. And so there's that component. A lot of it is a lot of pain and a lot of baggage from my childhood.
Right. So I want to interject here with the distinction that your depression is a mix of not only chemical
mm-hmm.
depression, which is what the medication that you take
right.
helps even things out.
Right.
There's an imbalance within you, within your physical body and within your brain.
Right.
But there's also depression that's caused by trauma.
Exactly. Yeah.
That was experienced early in your childhood.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get to that, because that's one of those, or several of those root cause things that we discovered as you were doing inventory.
Yeah. So, growing up, my dad was never really a part of my life. So he bailed before I was born, and I remember vague times when he was kind of there. And when I was a freshman in high school for about 3 months, I lived with him for a while, and I decided I wanted to go back to be with my mom and my brother. But my mom, she has her own mental health issues and her own addiction issues. And so, growing up, I didn't realize it, I didn't realize what was fueling it, but there was a lot of physical abuse. A lot of being beaten unconscious, I still have a scar that goes around my back from one of the beatings. And for whatever reason, I still don't quite know what it was. And I don't really think it wasn't important. It wasn't super important to figure out for me in my recovery, but it was almost like there was something that she resented in me that was not my fault. And I don't know if I reminded her of my dad. They were high school sweethearts, and I know that she loved him. And I'm sure, my mom was super bright, very resourceful. A lot of the good attributes that I have, I can contribute directly to my mom. I know, attribute, and she was starting to go to college, and then she got pregnant, and then she had to try, and then now she's the single mom. And on top of that, she's got the rejection and the abandonment of her husband and my father. And maybe there was part of that I reminded her of that. I don't really know. And, but all I know is that I just drew her higher. I just had a way. I was just a magnet for it, more so than my brother was. And my half brother, different dad. He was also a lot quieter, better kid than me. I was loud and messy and, big.
But in the true sense of, you were a victim.
Yeah.
In some circumstances, in some situations in your childhood.
Yeah. And a lot of that came with a lot of moving, a lot of my mom getting in relationships and not working out, and then just a quick exit to a new place to live, a new school district, I'd pretty much been to half the schools in Cincinnati. And, it just felt like any time that there was any kind of a moment of stability or normalcy in my life, it was just, the rug was pulled out. And so volatile instability, yes,
was your norm.
Yeah. And so there was always this sense of, I can't get too attached to whatever good is going on in my life, because it's going to get pulled out from underneath me. which speaks to that shoe that I was always waiting to drop, because the shoe always dropped.
So detachment was part of the regular out of defense, a defense mechanism for you.
Detachment. And then, as I got a little bit older, I remember I started playing video games, and I got interested in music, and like those were anything that I could do by myself became the things that I was drawn to, because they didn't require me to get attached to anybody else. And it was just, craziness upon craziness upon craziness. And, like the whole time, depression, looking back now, I didn't realize it then, but the whole time, my one constant companion was my depression, always there. And it really came to a head when I was 13. I remember my brother waking me up crying one morning, and he's sobbing, and he's saying, "They're taking mommy. Like, they're taking mommy. They're taking mommy." He just repeat, and I don't know what's going on, And there had been some really erratic behavior from my mom, like a lot of paranoia, a lot of, I noticed she was shopping a lot, and I was like, she wasn't working at the time, and I was like, but even at 13, I was kind of like, I don't, part of me was like, hey, mom got me a new CD. Like, I don't care. Like, let's go throw in this Audio Slave album. This will be dope.
There's an age gap between me and Matt, so I'm chuckling that he was 13 when listening to an Audio Slave. Right. I may have already been out of college.
Yeah. And it was a great album. That first album was really good.
It was. Coach East is what,
dude. Yeah.
Name me a better opening track.
Yeah. And so he wakes me up, and he's crying, and my brother's 5 years younger than me, so he would have been 8 at the time, somewhere around there. I always protected my brother. So instantly I'm up in arms. I'm like ready to charge. I'm like, I don't know what's happening. I come out, and I remember like looking out in the hallway and towards our front door, and my mom's being taken out in handcuffs. And I remember like my vision just tunneling in, and I don't remember anything else from that day until that night. And my grandparents, who were always involved in our lives, always trying their best to protect us, they didn't really know what was going on. They didn't know about the abuse. They didn't know about, my mom did a good job of kind of isolating us from, specifically isolating me, like kind of making my grandparents seem like the enemy, and like, you don't know what they're like. You don't know how they treat me. And so I didn't trust anybody. I didn't trust anybody naturally at this point. I didn't know any better.
Right.
And I remember the next thing I remember that day is my grandparents tucking us into bed that night, and they're praying for us. And we did this like Bible story thing. And I remember like that night was like the first comfort I had felt in a long time. And, I don't know how long we were there, but it wasn't too long. And the routine and the structure of like, I get up and somebody's made me breakfast. I get up and my, like, hey, like, this is what we need for the day. Like, getting me out the door, and somebody's there greeting me when I get home. How was your day? And, somebody tucking me in at night. And I remember like being happy and like comforted for the first time in my life. And I was like, I don't want to go back. Like, I knew then I didn't want to go back.
Right. Because at this point now you have some semblance of some structure.
Yeah.
And some positive reinforcement, that, 13 years old is a very formidable year.
For sure.
You were probably man-sized.
Yeah, for sure.
At 13, yeah. 6 foot and already grown a beard, but
just the biggest toddler-looking man-child you've ever seen in your life. Baby Bungie.
But leading up to this point in your life, there's massive deficits and deficiencies in your emotional well-being, in your spiritual well-being, in your mental well-being. And that's got to be, just a paradigm shift at the least, to say the
For
least,
sure.
right?
I mean, just the immediate contrast was should have honestly, had it not been so comforting, would have been startling.
Sure.
And just as I was about to I took to it immediately. I loved it, and I didn't want to go back. And next thing I know, like, my mom picks me up. She's out of jail.
So this is,
and I'm back home.
This is a few weeks.
I don't remember, but it was something like that, a week or two. It was not long, even if it was that.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember just like that feeling of like,
I'm getting duped again.
I can't believe you guys, like, I was just like, cause I just thought that people knew. I thought that it was just common knowledge what was going on at home. Like, I thought my grandparents knew. I just didn't know. I didn't know any better. And so there's part of me that's like, now that I've experienced what a loving home is, I'm like, why in the hell would you ever let me come back here?
So you have a misconception that your grandparents now are apathetic.
Yeah, and something along those lines for sure. And it kind of, I remember that moment because, and I'm not sharing that, like, I definitely, like, I love my grandparents are the closest people. I mean, they just, they saved me. But at the time at 13, I didn't know any better. And so it's like this resentment and this hurt and this like abandonment. I was like, why would you let me come back here?
Right.
And it was that point that it was at that moment that my trust in anybody died for a long time. And I don't know how long it took after that, but eventually I think she got arrested again or something forced her hand, and my aunt and uncle took us in. And man, like, I was not as welcoming to the change this time. I fought him. I mean, I just fought. There was resistance at every turn. I just fought, especially, like with my uncle, like, I'd not had a father figure in my life like that. And so he's trying to parent me and I'm not having it. I'm just like, I'm just pushing back at every turn. But
there's some dynamics that aren't copacetic.
Right. And, on top of this, they have their own kids. They have my cousin, they have a daughter and a son, and, Derek and Jake were the same age, and Allie was a couple years younger than me, or something like that, somewhere close to that. And it's not like they don't have their own responsibilities. And here I am just being a turd the whole way. And, obviously, hindsight, I can give myself a little bit of grace. I'm like, okay, like, you didn't know what you're doing. But I fought them, but they persisted in caring for me, and not just in comforting me, but also correcting me in a way that I know, even if it didn't take at the time, it did change the trajectory of what could have been in my life. And I will always be grateful to both my grandparents and my aunt and uncle, because, I mean, they saved me. They pulled me out. Even, and they knew that things were bad, but they didn't know how bad, and they did it anyways. And, through my mom's continuous downward spiral, I mean, she had basically lost her mind at this point from her drug abuse, and, I mean, cameras in the vents and going out back and cutting the cable lines to everybody's apartment, which I'm sure they were huge. If she already wasn't on the hit list for that apartment complex, she definitely was after that. And I remember hearing the story later that my aunt went to pick up my mom for the court date, where they decide what was kind of the fate of what was going to happen to my brother and I. And that's when she did the whole cutting the cable thing, and she wasn't ready. And hey guys, sorry so much to interrupt the podcast, but I have both good news and bad news. The bad news is the recorder cut out again. This is the third time, and I'm very sorry for that. It really bothers me that it's happened again. But the good news is that we have finally solved the issue, and I've recorded more episodes past this and not had the issue. So this shouldn't be something moving forward. All of that said, I appreciate your patience, and we're going to restart the podcast right about now. All right. Sorry about that, guys. Again, I've got some power issues going on with the recorder that I'm working to rectify, so I don't have to keep doing this. But I left off with my aunt and uncle, my grandparents, in the custody battle, and they were preparing for a custody battle, and they were prepared at this point to do whatever it took.
And that's that for a 13, 14-year-old kid who has no idea that your relatives, their hands are tied due to the legal rights that your mom has being your mom,
right,
and custody. So you have no awareness, no frame of reference that even if your grandparents demonstrated to you directly the desire for you to stay with them, their hands were tied,
right.
Due to those legal rights. And so what you learned retrospectively is that they were definitely in action behind, but for lack of a better term, behind the scenes, to help, as you've said, save you and your brother from the conditions of, at the time, living with your mom.
Yeah. And in looking back, it I don't know the exact timeline, but they did it pretty quick. And a lot of that was aided by my mom's own doing. And,
Right.
And at the time that she was gone. And basically the choice was, listen, what was explained to me is that they had the conversation like, listen, we'll drag you through court if we have to get this done. Or you can sign over your rights to the boys to somebody. And so she agreed to sign over the rights to my grandparents. So again, even in that, I just gotten to the point where I was comfortable at my aunt and uncle's, and now I'm back with my grandparents.
Right. So it's another shift.
And I'm changing school districts, and like all of the friends that I had made, like now I'm not there, and it's just,
it's disruptive.
yeah. And so I just spent the rest of my time fighting them, my teenage years. And at this point, there was no drugs or alcohol, really didn't enter in my life. It just wasn't around, no matter where I went. And, my grandparents definitely pushed for me to be involved in church and all of that, which, was good and bad, not on their part, just in the place I was. And,
right.
Not that it's a bad church. It's just, there were certain things that didn't fit with me, that didn't work with me. But
you and I have a shared stories in that there were some elements that we weren't exactly receptive to.
Exactly.
And upbringing in the church and, youth involvement.
Yeah. And, like we had a youth group where I went and stuff, but being, even though they labeled themselves as non-denominational, it was very like a lot of the background for people that were there in the beginning. It was like a lot of Church of God. So a lot Pentecostal, and, I don't want to sit here and make it sound like I'm just bashing Pentecost, like being Pentecostal over the head. Like it's just, there were certain things about it that didn't work for me. Like,
right.
and like I couldn't speak in tongues. And so like there was a certain level amongst my peers, I never really felt that from pastors or anything like that, but amongst my peers that like there was something wrong with me. And, well, the pastors of that church anyways, my mom was married to this one dude for a while, and like the church that we went to, his dad was the pastor, and like I remember I couldn't speak in tongues, so they like pulled me in a room after service and prayed for me like legit for the entire afternoon. And I was just like, at first I was like terrified, like what the hell is happening right now? And then by the end of it, I was like, I'm hungry.
Right.
Like, can we get lunch? Can we break for lunch? Like, does God care? Like, is this going to set the process back? I remember them just giving up, and like the look of disdain was just like, you're a lost cause. And I was like, all right.
Well, you guys can stay here and keep praying.
Yeah. Like, I'm going to McDonald's. Like, but
I don't remember fasting being part of this.
Right. Yeah, I was definitely not receptive to fasting at 14 or whatever it was. And anyways, so we go on high school. I kind of like, I hated high school personally. I was part. I don't. Yeah, I'm not going to blame it all on the experience, but it was a lot of it was me. Just like I had no hope for a few. I'd gotten to the place where I was sure the sky wasn't falling anymore. Once I got into the place, I'm like, I'm here to stay with my grandparents, and they did a great job. Nothing. It's no fault of them. It's just how I'm processing this at this point in my life. That I'm just like, I just didn't give a shit at some point. Like I was just like, I was. The only word that comes to mind is I was exhausted emotionally. I didn't care about my future. I didn't care about graduating. Like the only kind of positive reinforcement I had was sports. And so that kind of kept me on the straight and narrow to an extent. Like, I found some success in football and
right. But you, to this point, your childhood was an act of survival.
Yeah. And so once there was nothing to survive anymore, I didn't know what to do.
Right.
Like my brain was wired to survive, and making it through a day was my only sense of future. And so I barely graduated, much to the chagrin of my grandparents. I mean,
fair to say that your high school experience was a Groundhog Day experience.
Yeah. Like, I just didn't fit in,
right?
Because I remember that just further drove that isolation. Because like I didn't see anybody around me that could relate to me, and I'm sure there were people, but like whenever all the things that everybody else cared about, I just didn't care about. Like, because of my life experience, like the normal things that a teenager would care about were just like I was just like it just was so far out of my mind, like that. I was, without having a crisis to survive, I didn't have a direction.
Right.
And I just felt lost.
And coupled with your predisposition of detachment,
mm-hmm.
You didn't have anything anchor to either.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, other than Kyle, Kyle and I met not long after I'd switched school districts and I started attending the church that I mentioned before. And he was the one kid I got, like, we just hit it off. I was like, because there was some part of it that was like, and for those of you who know Kyle, like, there's like, he's kind of an open book to a point. And I don't know, there was just a sense that like, I knew he was screwed up. He knew I was screwed up. And so like, we just hit it off, and I had no idea that this would end up being a lifelong friendship and a brotherhood, really. And now we work, we both got sober around the same time. We both work recovery side by side. He's an everyday part of my life. But other than Kyle, I didn't really see him in school. He was a grade below me, and so I don't know. Like once football was done, I just, I had missed half my senior season, which was when I really kind of came into my own as an athlete. And, I kind of grew into my body, which it sounds like an oxymoron considering I was 6'5", in my senior year. But, so my only sense of direction was I'm going to go play football in college. Well, halfway through my season, I have this, what I think was probably a panic attack of some sort. And that's when they find out, like, there's a little bit of irregularity with you know what I'm trying to say, with my heart. And so they're like, you're done until we figure this out. So that was my season. So I think I played 5 or 6 games that year, and then I was done. And after that was taken, like, I realized that it was being away from football. Like, I didn't have the drive to go back. Like, I didn't love it the way that you have to love football to play at the next level in college. And so I don't know. Honestly, by the grace of God, I didn't pursue it because it wasn't for me. It wasn't right for me. But without it, I didn't have any direction. I didn't have any interest, and I hated school, definitely. So like, I didn't really want to go to college, but so I barely graduate, and then I start working, and that's when I start to get exposed to other things. I start to get exposed to alcohol and weed and drug use from, if you it doesn't matter whether you're working in retail or the food industry. Like if you're working in the service industry, you're going to work with somebody who is going to expose you to drugs and alcohol. And that's basically kind of what happened. And even then, like, kind of like drank a few times, smoked weed a few times, but there was always part of me that was like, from my experience with my mom, that I didn't want to get involved. And so I didn't for a while. But still kind of drifting through life, no sense of direction until I met, and eventually kind of what was the catalyst to kind of setting a direction in my life was, I remember I finally had a moment with the church I was going to where I realized that there were things theologically I didn't agree with. So, I didn't leave mad, but I was like, this isn't for me. So I left, and my aunt and uncle at the time were attending Rivers Crossing. Went there, and the issue that I had concerned, kind of the Pentecostal view about the Holy Spirit and speaking in tongues and kind of following that vein. And what is the first thing that the series that they are just starting that Sunday is a series I'll never forget. It's called Supercharged, and it's about the Holy Spirit. And I sat there and I was like, like, how about that, And so again, like looking back now, I can see where God's ordering my steps without me realizing it. And I get involved with the band, and from there, I kind of start to make friends, and I meet a guy named Mike, and since I've kind of lost contact with, I wish I knew how to reach him. But from there, he's kind of like my big brother figure, and he kind of introduces me to, like different music. And, at some point I remember we would sit back in his backyard and smoke cigars and just chat about whatever. And that was a formative experience in my life. It kind of opened the door for me, opening the door to other people in a sense. And from there, I meet Natalie. Well, actually, what happens before that is he says, hey, we got this summer gig at this HVAC company that I work for. You want to come work for the summer? And so I went and worked for the summer. I started traveling, and, I'm making pretty good money for a 20-year-old kid, mainly because we're working 80 hours a week for 3 weeks straight. And
a per diem on top of it.
Yeah. So, but it was a good experience, like I never really traveled up to that point. I'd never been on my own, and, I'm doing my own laundry, and we're in a different place every day, and I'm traveling, all through the Midwest and, the Southeast, and it was good for me. And I was like, okay, I'll do HVAC. And so I went to tech school, and around that time I meet my wife, my soon-to-be wife, my eventual wife, and I meet Natalie, and that's when I realize I want to ask her to marry me, but I don't want to ask her until I've got a career path set. So I go to tech school and ask her to marry me, become an HVAC tech, and that kind of is my trajectory into my young adult life. At this point, I'd done I enjoyed hearing people say they were proud of me at that point, because I was doing something. To me, it felt like I just kind of was stumbling around in the dark and happened to find something, and it stuck. But people are like, man, like, I remember it's like, I'm really proud of you for taking the step to do something with your life. And, and so from there, I start to cultivate this image that I've overcome my past. I've dealt with it. I'm good to go. You guys don't need to worry about me. But my depression keeps getting worse. My anxiety keeps getting worse. I feel this hole inside of me growing bigger and bigger and deeper and darker every day. And especially as all these changes start happening, and I'm embarking into my adult life and getting married and all of these things, I start to like dabble with drinking, but not in the sense of partying or anything. It was like I got into craft beer, and that was like a big thing in like non-denominational churches back then. Was like, that was the acceptable way. that was our cover as abusers. I'm just into craft beer, bro. And from there I like got buzzed a few. I'm like, okay, so I'm into craft beer, and it's kind of like our social thing to do. And Natalie and I get married, and still not taking anything too far, but I remember there was like maybe 2 or 3 times where I started drinking by myself. And I was like, okay, this is kind of nice. Like there was something that clicked in me subconsciously that like I can have these moments. I can kind of force feed myself these moments of reprieve from my depression for a while, you know, especially in the early days when you haven't done it enough to really experience the consequences of what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
It feels, you're like, oh, dope. This is awesome. And then from there, I remember like I was like 4 or 5 beers deep, and one night Natalie was out of the house, and like I walked by and there just happened to be a Vicodin prescription on the end table. She had just had her gallbladder taken out or something. And I was like, just pop one of these. And I was like, that was pretty nice. Whatever. Went to work the next day, and I'm working that day, and I was like, that's pretty. I should just do that without the beer. And I went from never having abused anything really, and to like I went on a month-long bender of like, I remember the first time that I got high on opiates, it felt like it was like a spiritual experience for me, where I was like all of the mask that I was wearing and kind of the lies, the image that I was building for everybody else, I was also trying to convince myself was true, that I had it all together, that that all of the horrors in my past had not held me back. I got high and all of that BS disappeared. And I remember that was the first time I didn't feel depressed. And I was like, I want to be like this forever. That was that dragon that everybody chases, right? That was my dragon. And I'd used everything I could get my hands on. And when I ran out of painkillers, I remember like there was some barbiturates or whatever, the other kind of super downer my wife had. And I'm like, try these. And my wife at the time had gone to a concert with her sister, and she was supposed to spend the night over there. So I knew that I had the house to myself. I remember taking one, didn't feel anything. Taking another one, I didn't feel anything. Taking the other one, didn't feel anything. I think I was 4 in, and all of a sudden it was like fade to black. I remember like, I need to lay down, and then that's it. Like when I woke up before I opened my eyes, the first thing I heard was the beep of the hospital monitor. And I heard my family talking, and I heard my wife crying, and I remember thinking like, oh shit, I messed up. And I opened my eyes, and my family's around, and I remember just kind of fading back out. And when I came back, I'm in the hospital bed. I got a catheter in. My wife's absolutely devastated, and they discharged me. And I don't know what happened. I know my face is sore. Come to find out that like the doctor, in his infinite wisdom, to demonstrate to my wife that I was indeed completely unconscious, had like smacked me in the face repeatedly. Like, see, he's not going to wait. Whack! and my wife tells a story like, I kept waiting for you to wake up and like Undertaker. And I didn't. I was completely. I come to find out that my wife tried to call me. I didn't answer, and she just had this feeling that something was wrong, and so she left the concert and came home. Couldn't get in the house, like couldn't get in, like, but she can see that I'm laying in the bed, like, because we lived in like a little 550 square foot apartment that was basically like, we had the downstairs, and then some friends of ours actually lived above us, and kind of the access to the basement there was just one door, that they had a door and we had a door, and then there was the basement stairs. And she got Will from downstairs or upstairs. He comes down, he kicks open the door, and I'm just laying on the bed, not conscious. And so they called the paramedics. When they did the tox screen, I had everything in my system. I had sleeping pills, I had barbiturates, I had alcohol, I had some opiates. Like, I don't remember any of this. Like, I don't remember drinking. I just blacked out, and I just took everything. And, but there was this sense of relief, like the gig's up, like there was some relief in being found out in that moment. And there was something that you shared in yours. I think I took the clip of that and I put it at the beginning of your episode. And like, there's nowhere to run anymore. Like,
right.
The gig's up. The unfortunate part is that I wasn't ready to quit. And so from there, it was alcohol and like cough syrup and a lot of drinking and a lot of that. And I didn't like it. Alcohol was never my drug of choice to use on a regular basis. Like, it just wasn't my thing, but it was available. And so I did it. I remember my wife being miserable. I remember at this point, you know, we have our first child, Marley, and I was pretty much absent for the first year of her life. And I mean, I was there, but I wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And all I could think about was drinking that night. And at some point I got introduced to Kratom. I wasn't introduced. I figured it out. I used my astounding resourcefulness to find my next drug of choice, and it was legal. And it was better than alcohol. And so that's what I switched to at some point. And we have Maddie. And at this point I've kind of just stayed in this. Well, let me back up actually. So I have my overdose. It devastates my family. It just blindsided them. They had no idea it was coming. They had no idea something was wrong. I mean, when I say I took the fast track, I mean, in a month's time, I went from never having abused really anything to I end up in the hospital with an overdose that should have killed me. And so I come to CR. And I'd been a few times, but I'd never shared much or done anything. And I remember sitting in the room, and I'm sure that like other people had I'm sure like Randy and Carol and a few other people knew what happened, but I didn't tell them. I didn't know that they knew, or I'm just assuming at this point. Sitting in this room, and we were in here actually, in the very room we're doing this podcast in. And I'm sitting at the table, and I know I need to share what's going on. And I'm terrified. Like, what are they going to think? Like, if these people find out, they're never going to look at me the same way again.
Right. The cracked facade.
Yeah. And so I finally speak up, and I go, I tell them what happened, and I'm looking around, and I'm crying. Like I'm literally talking with my hands over my face to let people not see that I'm crying. Like, come on, dude. Like, I don't know, 6'5". Like, what am I like playing peekaboo with my tears.
Didn't give it away.
Right. And dude, like when I cry, dude, there is no hiding. Like I don't cry often, but when I do, it just overwhelms me. And I look up from my tears and I look around, and it's like in the best way possible, it looks like nobody gives a shit. And I say that in the like no, and I say that in the sense that like nobody bats an eye.
Right.
It's not like they're like
right. There's no shock and awe to it.
Yeah, they're just like, hey man, like the only thing I hear is like, thanks Matt, like glad you're here, man. Like this is the place for you. Like all I hear is encouragement, and I'm just like, oh, that went well. Okay, like,
look how special I am now.
Right. I still thought I was. I just thought, man, these people must be really messed up. Like, but I kind of at this point, I think I strained together 90 days. Something like that. And then I kind of relapse. And at this point I'm exhausted. Like I had white knuckled it to 90 days and I was exhausted. And I'm like, I can't do this anymore. So I basically just go back out and.
Well, and give it its due, right? 90 days, we talked about it already. It's, it's 12 weeks, roughly 3 months. For people who aren't addicts or, substance abusers, a lot of times they're convinced that, okay, we don't have to worry about, the change behavior seems to be, evident,
mm-hmm.
And part of my story and many others is we do enough to get the heat off.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm flying under the radar. And couple that with, you're tired.
Yeah.
because it is a strain to try and do this without a program.
Yeah.
You know,
And I mean, I was coming to CR. I wasn't working the program yet. I hadn't surrendered.
oh yeah, because the charade is work. It's like you just took on a full-time job that you clock in and you clock out because you got to show up, you got to go through the motions, you got to talk the right talk, you got to do the right things, seemingly. And that's one of the insanity notions, right? Is that, well, if you're going to put that much effort into it, just do it.
Right.
Right? Because to fake it, it's mind numbing. The kind of investment somebody has to go to, the lengths someone has to go to produce a pretty authentic charade.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, why would you fake it at that point?
It's the reason why acting is a job.
Yes.
It's a profession.
1,000%. But I mean, I relate wholeheartedly because that's exactly what I did too.
I don't know if I just hadn't been beaten down enough yet by my experiences that I had the energy to do it, but I did it. And, I mean, I was, at this point, I'd gotten pretty good at least I thought, at doing the charades thing. But I hadn't surrendered yet. And so there's no recovery program I've seen that really works that doesn't involve you surrendering to a higher power. And so I hadn't. And so from that point, I had a few very brief moments. I mean, weeks maybe of sobriety, but I realized pretty quick that it was exhausting, the charades part. And so I just slowly but surely just kind of, my willpower to pretend kind of eroded. And as people found out, I realized like at some point I just stopped caring. Like,
and one thing is I'm going to put my sponsor hat on for a second, take my host hat off, and at risk of lecturing you on your own podcast, when one doesn't use for just a short period of time, I don't know if that's really sobriety.
It's I say that tongue in cheek for sure.
I'll make that argument because one of the things that we've definitely experienced is abstinence is a necessary ingredient, right? It's a mandate, right? But it's also coupled with the enlightenment that serenity provides us, and that connection, that personal relationship with our higher power, and when we only have one of the 5 ingredients, what that is that's the white knuckled abstinence. That's me like, all right, I'm just taking a break.
Right. Yeah. That's an important distinction to make. And I know what I mean, but I'm glad you took the time to clarify that, because none of that was sobriety. That was abstinence. And, I say it, in my mind, there's a little bit of tongue in cheek, but that doesn't necessarily translate over a voice only podcast.
You're right.
So
yeah, can't see your tongue in the cheek.
So, but I continue, kind of becoming become just a full blown functioning addict. And so I'm working, I'm providing for my family. My wife still hasn't figured out her career yet. At some point we have our second child, Maddie, and I vowed to stop drinking when she was right before she was born, and I might have drank a few times. I think I drank a few times in that span, but for the most part, for the last 6 years, I haven't drank. And
anybody looking in from the outside would say that is admirable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, honestly, that was kind of like that was like the last cover I had to kind of fade the heat was. Now, my wife knew.
Was that an intentionally manipulative play, or was like, oh, that was smart. That was smarter than I expected it to be.
It's the latter. Yeah. Like I'd love to say I was smart enough to come up with that kind of I'm that cunning, but honestly, like I legitimately was like, drinking's bad for me. I mean, I remember a moment where I was like, there's a certain point with your drinking, unless you just have access to way more money than I had, that I went from like craft beer that cost $15 a 6-pack to I'm going to buy Evan Williams in a plastic jug. I remember at one point looking over at, before Maddie was born, I had my own room, which is perfect for somebody who has isolating tendencies to isolate.
Right.
And I look over and there's like 4 or 5 empty gallon jugs, and I was like, those weren't there last week. Like, and I was like, this is bad. But all I did was trade alcohol for kratom. That's all I did, and it was a much more sustainable, quote unquote, I'm air quoting, at least
economically.
I wouldn't even say economically.
No.
I would say in terms of like the physical harm it was doing to my body, and the fact that I could use it and not appear like there was no like
telltale signs of like, oh, you're bloodshot or you're slurring your words, or
yeah. And so, you know, it like my thing was I would use, and then I'd play video games into the wee hours of the morning, and I was like, it started off with me, I'm only going to use on like these days, and you know, I'm going to go to bed early the next day, so I'm ready for the day after.
The attempted controlled use.
Yes, yeah, I tried. I failed. I tried though. I did try. You can't say I didn't try. And that lasted me up until the point that we started the podcast in 2020, and it slowly devolved into an everyday thing. And I wasn't sleeping, and I was exhausted, and put on a crap ton of weight because I was not sleeping and exhausted. And I don't know about you, but when I'm tired, I don't feel like eating a salad. And
I don't ever feel like eating a salad.
Yeah, come on, work with me here. Wrong person to ask. Sorry. No,
do they have bacon salads?
Right. If there's bacon in it, I guess, I don't know, buffalo sauce or chicken. But yeah, that led us to 2020 and where I was at. And then when COVID hit, like I said, I just went, well, you know, right before the year before, I was just becoming a miserable jerk. And there was nobody in my life that I spent any amount of time with that didn't suffer for it. And, you know, at the time I was really involved with the band at church, and there was some resentments that were honestly probably the key part of my inventory towards my uncle in particular, because like when I had my overdose, it really kind of like fractured our relationship, and I can't blame him for any of that. He didn't do it. You know, he wasn't expecting it. I'm sure, you know, I don't know how, you know, we've talked it through, but you know, I can only imagine how it made him feel, and our relationship wasn't the same after that. And I held a lot of resentment towards him, and I was just a difficult person to be around. And so at some point, you know, kind of the one thing tying me to church was that I was playing in the band. And because it was the one thing in the church that I felt like I could do to be useful. And at one point, a couple leaders in the church sat me down and they said, "Hey, we think you need to take a break. And I think there's some things in your life that you need to address." And when I was out of the band, I left the church, and I had no intention of coming back, really. And it leads us into 2020. Guess what? Nobody can go anywhere. Perfect.
Right.
That plays right into what I'm all about, my isolation. And so I just I tripled down on my using.
Right.
And
right. The flop treated you well, and now you're ready for the river.
Dude, when it happened, I was like, hell yeah. Like, this is right where I want to be. And yeah. And so I just ramped up my using to multiple times a day, and quickly realized that I can't do this forever. Something's got to change, or I'm going to wind up dead or divorced or both, or like homeless. I don't know what. Nothing good is going to come out of this. And so that's what led me into the step study, and where we started this podcast. Very roundabout way. So what got us on this? The inventory?
Yep. And I'll quite honestly, this is exactly the course I had envisioned.
Yeah.
If you've not heard my official testimony, my official CR testimony, I actually give a disclaimer that I present it in a Quentin Tarantino type format.
Nice.
That it zigzags about
Mr. Blue. All right.
As long as I'm not Mr. Pink.
Right.
So we're right at about 2 hours.
Okay.
Have we not touched on anything that you really felt compelled that you wanted to share in this particular episode?
Honestly, for me, I think it's important. I'm going to kind of put my host hat back on for a second. And as I've done these stories with people, it's important to talk about all of the things that led up to getting sober.
Yes.
And I'm glad that and you did a great job, by the way, I enjoyed the fact that we started out talking about my time and in sobriety, because that's the stuff that's really important. And there's a reason, like I know for you and for Paul and for some other people, I want to do a part 2 of your recovery stories, because I want to talk about the things that happened after you got sober. And
yeah, because that's one of the things that I talk about too. For those who haven't heard my episode, I've got a little more than 18 years of continuous sobriety and freedom from drugs and alcohol. And I say that not for any personal accolades. I that is a testament that long-term sobriety is possible, and that the 12-step program does work if you work it. But what I also know, because you can't help after that many 24 hours, which is, about 6,700 days, if you're counting.
it's a lot of phone calls.
It is a lot of phone calls. But one of the things that's it's undeniable is that I'm the pickle that can never become a cucumber again. I'm an alcoholic. I will always be an alcoholic. And as we sit here and do this episode, my alcoholism, my disease, is doing push-ups next to my truck out in front of the building. I am more interested in the distance I put between me and my next drink than I am about the distance between me and my last drink, because my last drink can no longer hurt me. But if I subscribe, and I do, to the notion that I will always be an alcoholic and my nature is to drink, my nature is to use, and if I am not participating in my recovery and I am not spiritually fit, that nature will take over, and I will go and find comfort the way I knew how to. And the big book talks in great specifics about what assures me the most insulation is working with others. And so that's an important piece of what I want to share with others too, as well as the fact that 18 years is a lot of time for a lot of life to happen. And it is not all rosy. It is not all rosy. But thanks to the spiritual toolkit that I'm provided through the 12-step program and through life experience, and having a fellowship that I can tap into of other people who might be a little further down the path than I, or have different experiences that I can use as resources when life gets bumpy and trials and tribulations occur, because they're going to. We're promised that. I have a better chance of navigating them without exhibiting that tail turn and run like we talked about earlier.
Yeah. I feel like my life began 2.5 years ago.
It's a rebirth.
I was 31 when I got sober, and I shared in my kind of written testimony that I present in CR. And when I was living with my grandparents through high school, and in our dining room, my grandparents had a scripture stenciled on the wall, and I saw it every day. And I think it's Jeremiah 26:11, something along that. I'm sorry if I got it wrong, but, and this is as verbatim as I can pull out of my head right now. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. And I saw that every day, never gave it any thought until I got sober. And I realized once I did my inventory and I took the time to reflect, not just on the bad things, but on all the ways that God had ordered my steps and ordered the steps of the people in my life that cared for me, that he had a plan for me. to prosper me and not to harm me, plans for a hope and a future. And there were so many people that were in my corner that I didn't deserve any of it. There were so many people pulling for me. Even you and I talking about Paul Salazar, he had pulled you to the side and said, "Hey, I want you to look out for these guys." And this was before I had even mentioned getting sober or joining a step study. He mentioned to you, like, "Hey,"
it was more than almost a year and a half. It was at the time that he left and moved from Cincinnati to Oklahoma City.
Yeah, and there were so many people in CR that when I got sober, were there, and we're like, we knew it was just a matter of time. And thank God for those people. And I mean, I know for as much as I used to think that I was a one-man island,
mm-hmm.
and I existed in a vacuum. I didn't need anybody else. I depended on a lot of people even before I knew it.
Yes.
To do for me what I could not do for myself. And then when I got sober, really all that changed is that I became an active participant in that social transaction, that emotional support of me asking for help. I asked for it. And, I always ask people, like, are there any words you want to end on? And these are the words that I want to end this episode on. I had no hope when I started that step study in 2020. I wanted to die, really. I didn't, I wasn't suicidal, and I never wanted to I didn't want to take my own life, but there were times I'm like, I just don't want to wake up tomorrow.
Right.
And this is with two beautiful girls and a wife that loved me way more than I deserved, and friends that stood by me that shouldn't have, and my grandparents who pulled me out of the situation I was, who I know there were many sleepless nights up praying for me, and my aunt and uncle who pulled me out and brought me into their home when they already had their own life. They could have chosen to not, but they did. And not only did they bring me into their home, they loved me and parented me. And all that, I still wanted to die. Through getting sober, when I prayed that you have to give me something better, he did. He didn't, but he already had. It just took peeling that onion back and pulling back that veil over my eyes, for me to realize that the better thing for me was right in front of me the whole time.
Yeah.
And now I experience, not only am I active in my kid's life, but I through the tool, that spiritual toolkit that you mentioned, through recovery and through the Holy Spirit and through God providing for me what I can't provide for myself. I look at it and I'm like, I'm as best of a dad as I can be. Whatever that means, I know that I'm doing my best and I'm loving my kids to the best of my ability. And I've seen it change. I've seen the change in them.
Mm.
My relationship with my wife, even though we still have our times where we're struggling and things, life pulls us 1,000 different directions. And I think many people can relate to this, where you kind of feel like you don't see each other for, like, my marriage is still better than it's ever been. I have a hope and a future. God has ordered my steps in finding a new job and being able to have the inspiration, I think, divinely, and the means to start this podcast. And even my mom, with all of the things and all of the past that we had and all of the abuse and all of the pain, she is a regular part of not just my life, but my kids' life. My kids love my mom. And I never thought that would happen. I had written off my mom completely.
Mm-hmm.
And there is I have yet to, you cannot convince me, if I was truly terminally unique and I was saved, I truly believe there's nobody that can stand on a solid claim that they are, genuinely. This program, there is hope in these programs. There is, if you were at the point, if you're listening to this and you're in a place where you're struggling, I don't think it was an accident. go to a meeting, go try it out, go talk to some people, just go sit in the rooms and hear what other people have to say and tell me that there's not something to this. And just to end it, just kind of a prompting. I just want to pray, if that's all right. And we'll just end it on this. God, I want to thank you for the opportunity that we have to do things like this, God. Not just the podcast, God. That's just a small portion of what you're doing in the big picture of recovery, God. And the stories that I hear and the people that I meet and the friendships that I have fostered through working the steps and through working these programs, God, it's nothing short of a miracle of what you do day in and day out through recovery, whether it be Celebrate Recovery or AA or NA, God. You were doing amazing things, Father. I know that not everybody's higher power not everybody's going to choose for you to be their higher power, but I believe that these recovery programs are divinely inspired, God, that you are working in them actively, God. And I want to pray, God, if there are people out there that don't know that places like CR and AA and NA exist, at least not to the extent that what Mitch and Daryl and all of and myself, all of these people that have been on this podcast have experienced, God, that we know that there's hope. And we know that you have plans to prosper us and not harm us, plans for hope and a future, God. I believe those things because you saved me. And if you can save me, I truly believe you can save anybody. So I want to pray for whoever is out there listening, God, whether they have 20 years in sobriety, 20 days or 20 hours, or they haven't even thought about stepping foot inside of a building that's having a recovery program going on, God, that you would encourage and lead the steps of everybody listening to engage in some process that brings us closer to you. God, this is for you and your glory. This is for you and to share what you're doing in these places. And I pray that it always remains that way. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.